So, I would like to welcome Sara Jakša here on our conference. I hope you will enjoy this place. Sara is going to tell us something about API authentication. And I think I will ask you to give us a warm welcome, please. Good luck.
Okay, thank you, everyone. So for any of you who listened to the presentation that has been here just before, it was really interesting because it started every time we tried to integrate with an APIs, we had problems. So now we're going to integrate with all the payment systems directly, which, okay, isn't that also integration with an API? Still an interesting talk. So today I'm going to talk about one of these specific parts that are usually important for the integration, and that's authentication. I'll try to go through I'll try to give an overview of the different types that I've seen in the wild. And I also try to actually tell some of my experience of how things can go interesting or wrong. So let's start with the most, it's called basic. Not entirely sure. It's probably called basics because it's really easy to do in the LAMP server, but this is a Python conference. All you do, when you look at the specifications, like you take username, password, you put them together with a column, you put it in base 64, and then you send that as a header. Please never use an actual username and password. Let me give you an example. Let me give you what can actually happen. We were integrating with, we usually write integrations that only gets the data, and years ago I wrote an integration. We increased the team, and there was, of course, a bug. And because they were using basic username and password, one of my colleagues decided, you know what, I can just log in into their account, and I'll check there and see what went wrong. And there was like this little button that says to reset an API token, even though it didn't have the API token. It reset something completely different, and it's still considered. Before the last acquisition, it was considered the biggest financial disaster we did for our customers in like 5 figures, because we reset something we shouldn't do. So seriously, don't do that. Protect the developers so they won't be able to do that. And actually, a lot of APIs don't do that. They use basic authentication with a lot of other values, and these are some of the examples of what you can use. You can just use an API key, or you can create some other values. You can add some random values, empty values, anything you want. Let's make sure that when it's an API authentication, it actually should only be able to talk with an API authentication. Of course, some people do. Also, there is another problem with using username and password. What do you do with multi-factor authentication? And actually, I think my favorite example it is when it's like, okay, to use into the website, you need two-factor authentication. To use their API, well, we'll just ignore that you said a two-factor authentication. It will allow you to use an API. I will say that some do not allow it, so API will just say they're using two-factor authentication, use something else or don't use the API. And there was one case when they tried to implement two-factor authentication in the API, which technically worked. So that one was also interesting. So you don't have just basic headers. You have also all the other headers that can also be used as an authentication. The most frequent one is probably bearer, which, as far as I'm aware, was originally used for OAuth, and it's now used for almost anything you want. Simply put authentication header, put bearer, and put whatever value you want there. So one of my colleagues at one point had an idea, authorization headers always have a specific type of form, right? It can be basic, it can be bearer, they're just limited amount. And he was like, we should be checking if the header is in correct type. This is how that code started. This is how that code looks now. And we remove it. If we remove integration, we removed. So there were other options at that time. So yeah, don't make assumptions that people will use the headers in the way they do. Use whatever the API requires. Of course, you don't have to technically use authorization headers. There are many types of headers. These are just some of the examples. The slides weren't big enough for all of them. As you can see, a lot of the headers are using like the X type. Anybody familiar with that? Okay, raise your hands if you use them. Yeah, you shouldn't. Well, technically, they say it's not recommended. It's a pretty interesting RFC, I think they're called like that, which basically explained if you use that and it becomes standard, then you have to technically support both of them. And so this custom one becomes standard by default without any process. What they recommend instead is just use your company name or company link in it. And you can see some of them do that. And just create whatever headers you want, because they assume that your company is not going to become a standard header for everybody to use. Of course, we're also going to go through two of the headers that are a bit more specific. Some APIs also use the cookies header, much more familiar for people that do the scraping and browsing. This was the only example that I could see. So in this case, you would just have, instead of authorization, you would have a cookie and you would have a key and a value. The reason why I like that is because this is the case when to get this cookie, you have to do some voodoo magic. This is the voodoo magic that you need to do based on that documentation. So what they want you to do is take a token, do a transformation on that, and then use this token to get a cookie. And this is the pull request review that I got on that code. I can read it. There is some voodoo magic here, but it confirms from the docs and also from here. Well, whatever flows their boat. On a previous talk, they were like talking about, how to make it secure, how to make it, scalable. There were questions about that. In our company, we figure out senior engineers don't want to work on integrations because integrations are Wild West and they can't use all of their methodology and testing and things like that. So we use junior engineers, and then we hope that you find somebody like me who won't run away when they become more senior. So assume that whoever's using your API is more likely to be junior than a senior, except if you're doing a payment application. One thing you can also use in the header, the JVT tokens. They generally just look like random string that starts with the E, epsilon, whatever, which you can parse to find out, different structures. Generally, you should never parse them to see if a token is valid. We did have a couple of examples of parsing a token to check for errors. We once implemented an API that had create a JVT token in the UI and set the expiration date. And by default, the expiration date was an hour and a half later. So we were using JVT parsing to provide ourselves a better errors. That it's like, yeah, a customer had provided you a token that's only valid for an hour and a half. Go talk to them to provide you a new one. We did had a problem with that in a different context. Once we decided to use like once we decided to make a new integration, which used more scopes, but we wanted to like save ourselves our work, and it's like, let's just check both of them with the same code. I mean, in most, and it goes like that, they give you credentials, you call a token endpoint, you get a JVT, and from what we can see, it had a scope, a scope's value in it. And it's like, okay, just check it. If it has a scope for an old one, just use an old one. If it has a scope one for a new one, just use a new one. And then we get a JVT that didn't have scopes in it, and everything failed. So yeah, JVT have a lot of interesting information, but honestly, usually just better to call an API and check if it's actually still valid. Because, you know, we're all programmers, we're all humans, we all make mistakes. And a lot of time documentation is missing on what values are supposed to mean inside it anyway. We also had an example where we had to sign a JVT token, thankfully only one. The biggest problem, how do you get customers to format this in the right way? We actually had to use custom code to try to figure out which part of that did they paste, and can we use that, and can we format it in the right way. Okay, now I want to talk about my favorite bug I've ever had to solve. At one point, we did some refactoring, and what happened? For one API, we were suddenly getting unauthorized errors. So like every credential had suddenly became invalid, which very rarely happens when you have 2-digit people that actually use the same integration. And one of my colleagues said that to me, because it's like, I have no idea what's going on. What did happen is whatever refactoring they do it, we no longer passed any user agent in it. And the API just decided, if there is no user agent, then I'll just assume I don't know who you are, and I'll just not allow you to use it. By the way, they allow you to use anything. I was like trying blah, 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 and it worked for some reason. So I don't know why they wanted it, but they check, yeah, do you pass it? Still probably my favorite bug. Okay, so we took over the headers. There is one that's probably easiest for people to start to play around it, because you can do it in the browser, which is just use it as the query parameters. And it's also generally pretty easy to implement and understandable. The problem is when it comes to the security, because by default, a lot of times you want to log your URLs to help with the debugging, and you really shouldn't be logging your credentials. And we got warned a couple of times, so I went to check what our security team is using to actually find them. They would find that. They would not find the below one. I was hoping I used the right Slovak word. Slovenian one's pretty similar. So if you want to, create a security hole, just use the same terms in a different language, and a lot of security teams simply won't find that bug, which is pretty sad, because I do want the programming and internet to become more international, but yeah, I guess that's not going to happen in the near future. Of course, you also have that type, which has exactly the same problem as the previous one, but thankfully we only had one case of an API wanted us to use that, and proxies that we use use that. So thankfully, that one is thankfully not frequent, also not recommended according to people. Okay. So these were like the basic ones that are frequent. We'll come to the OAuth in the end because it's a bit of specific use case. So let's go to some of the one. The just authentication is the one that's standardized. It's also the one that literally Googling it doesn't really help you understand what you need to implement. And I'm really happy that at least requests know how to do it. Though that was also the first time that I saw in request library to do. This thing isn't implemented yet. Thankfully, the one use case we had was. And unlike just doing one call, for each call, you do two. And, you do two, and you get basically just recalculate it a lot of time. We calculate a lot of hashes and pass these hashes and hope everything works, because if you calculate one hash incorrectly, it won't. And it's really annoying, but okay. I understand for security reasons why people would want to use that, because you don't want to send plain credentials like in most of the previous cases. Oh yeah, okay. You can also do it as a post body. This one is, for example, used in OAuth, but you can also use it. I saw some GraphQL APIs use it, and it's basically the same thing. Now, when I started half a decade ago working on integration as a junior, I remember one senior asking me, well, do you have any experience with SOAP APIs? And I was like, no, I never heard of them. And it's like, go research them. And that was 8 hours of reading that never helped me anywhere. Basically, what it is just everything you want to send is in XML that has a specific structure, and every API defines their own structure, and they never provide you an example. In a lot of cases. I see some people nodding, yeah. But what it basically does is you have like a header, which usually has credentials. I've seen use username, password. I see that use API tokens. I've seen it used, well, calculate some weird hash of something. You have the body below that tells you, okay, these are the things that I actually want, and then you put everything in an envelope tag. This is one example from our code base of how this thing actually looks like. And it's just that. That one, that's probably the shortest one we are using. So yeah. And it's really interesting because it's like, well, this is a completely different way of calling the APIs. And I'm like, well, on the end, you're still just sending XML. Is XML really so unusual that it requires something special? Okay. Okay, now the OAuth. I do have to admit, OAuth are my favorite type of authentication. Yeah, they are a bit complicated if you're only doing one integration. If you're doing 100 plus like we do, there is one of the most standardized way and one of the most reusable parts of our code that we have. So on the end, OAuth is basically for us, well, you do an app. You have to create an app with an API. They give you some values, and then we put these values in a JSON, and the code does everything for us. And it's also great from the customer perspective, because they just click on a button, and in most cases, everything works. Except, though there was one case that we have, when we were like, okay, they have enterprise plan, we want them to do a specific type of scope, and if they don't have enterprise plan, we wanted to do a specific type of scope, and apparently they don't really provide a descriptive error if you don't have an enterprise plan. So that was pretty interesting to figure out why it doesn't work. Unlike the rest of the credentials, it's really hard to actually replicate and see what actually went wrong. So how does OAuth works? They click on a button, they agree, yeah, you can get this data. They send it to your server, something, a code in a query parameter, and then you just use the previous values and that code to get an actual credentials. The only difference is sometimes they want it in the header, sometimes they want it in the body, but otherwise there is literally no if statements, almost no if statement in that code, and I really like that. Of course, app submission processes. This is just the list of some of the things that I had to do for app submission processes, from making a videos to changing the documentation to writing the statements that, yeah, they're not endorsing us, to have to come together in the documentation to prove that they work. My favorite case, it was like, well, we need to see a video of that you have the right query parameters when you call like our screen for the scopes, and we need to see how you delete credentials. And the second video that I posted was just like me clicking on revoke on our app and the credential disappeared, and they said, okay. So I'm not entirely sure what they were proving with that. Though I think the most frustrating part is at one app submission process, they wanted to prove that we are following the security standards. I'm a developer. I know we follow the security standards. I have literally no documentation, so I write to our security team, well, that's why we need this documentation. Can you provide it for us? And they say, well, have they signed a non-disclosure agreement? I'm a developer, I have no idea if they did. And they're like, well, ask them to sign a non-disclosure agreement. And it's like, it's a process in an app. I don't actually talk to humans there, so not entirely sure why they do that. And I asked our project manager, and they were like, you know what the solution it is? Let's find somebody in that company, and we're going to talk with them. So if you have an app submission process that has something the developer cannot do for himself, I hope you have somebody willing to take meetings. I don't know how they resolved in the end. I know the non-disclosure agreement was resolved because they were our customer, so apparently the contract covered that. I have no idea how it would happen if they were not. Also not idea, can you actually get a meeting with these people? They were a different app submission process where the meeting was a requirement so they can see what your use case was. That one was probably the best meeting I had with the outside companies. Also, OAuth are for third-party apps, right? Does anybody here disagrees? Okay, no. Who agrees that OAuth is the best? OAuth is particularly meant for third-party apps? Okay, not that many people. Interesting. Well, I actually thought that was like a requirement. So it was really interesting because I once had to, once I tried to implement, and I was like, okay, app submission, I can choose some of the scopes. And I didn't know why, so I contacted them. And they were like, yeah, well, you don't have the right plan. Yeah, I don't, but our common customers do, so can we use it for them? And they were like, I never thought of, that this would be used as a third party. I do have to agree, a couple of months later, they did provide that option, so that was one example of actually feedback bringing to some change, which doesn't always happen. The best one are like, well, we're integrating for our common customer, and they were like, well, have them send an email, and then the customer tell you they send an email, and the other side is telling you they didn't, and you're like, yeah, okay, whatever. Also, I want to talk about why I like the OAuth from a security feature. when we were doing some other refactoring of the code, because OAuth and some other things require to do a new refresh tokens every time, right? You also have to have a way to store these refresh tokens. So we saved the new state, and we did the bug when this state wasn't actually saved, and it was just saved as an empty value. So we lost all of the valid credentials. And there was like a problem, okay, we don't want the customers to actually reconnect everything. What we can do? Okay, database has like a backup. We can restore it from that, except for the OAuth with refresh tokens, because these values were no longer valid. And I think it's a good case, which is like, these can be secure even if somebody steals your database or things like that. And that's one of the other reasons that I use. Not every OAuth does use refresh tokens, so that's also one option. Okay. I have 4 minutes. Should I say it? Yeah, okay, I'll just finish here. So, so thank you for listening. I hope it was at least funny or interesting or educational. I wanted to give an overview and how it actually looks in the wild. I will end up with that. I spent the last half a decade dealing with third-party integrations. I love it, but all people around me are like holding their heads of how can you do with this Wild West. We got acquired, they reassigned our team, and we now have to connect to internal APIs. Third-party integrations are integrating with third parties is way better because you at least have some documentation and at least somebody put some thought into what somebody is going to be using it. And I really, really want to go back to that. So it might seem like it's problematic. It's actually great, and you should definitely do it. And maybe as a final thought, you can do whatever you want. Just put it in the documentation so we'll know what to do. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, we have some questions. You can also watch here. You don't have to turn around. Sara? Yeah, okay. What do you think of storing tokens in local storage versus cookies?
Yeah, okay.
You don't have to answer.
That's a good question, because all my integrations so far were server to server, so I didn't have to store anything in local and cookies. They did say that they want to return me as a front-end developer, so maybe I'll have an opinion in half a year.
Eventually. Thank you. What are your thoughts on OAuth 1 versus OAuth 2?
Honestly, as somebody implementing for that, OAuth 2 is easier to implement to, but I only had to do with like 2 APIs using OAuth 1, and it could be that the problems that I had with OAuth 1 were more connected to these specific APIs than with an actual specification. But from implementer perspective, OAuth 2 just simplified a couple of things. So, yeah.
Thanks. Okay. How do you persuade partners to actually fix their bad, insecure, plain bugged endpoint?
That's a good question, because my success rate is actually really low. Generally, what I did find increases the success of be annoying enough until support understand what your actual problem is. That definitely help. They're the ones that will have to champion that to their technical team to actually solve it. But other than that, honestly, I didn't find any factor that would like increase or not. In the 80%, they just ignore you, so yeah.
Would you agree that the most difficult part for a software engineer is to actually work with people than with the code? Or there are very tricky bugs that
Okay,
are...
a very personal opinion. The hardest part is work with other software engineers. For me personally, I find the support people and even the product and marketing people actually a lot more understandable than software engineers. And I'll take them and code over working with other software engineers every day. I do have to work with them, so yeah.
Thanks. Okay, I have heard about SAML. What is benefit to choose auth? Really? Okay.
Okay, whoever asked that, have you heard of SAML outside of the SSO? Because that's where I usually see it, and that's when I usually have to use it. Basically, I had to implement for both. OAuth is just easier to implement against because it's actually more consistent no matter what the people that wants to use SAML will tell you. But actual benefit as far as the security and things like that I don't know. I just know that implementing is easier for OAuth, so I would choose that from that perspective.
Okay, thank you. Do you want to answer any other questions? Or it's good? Oh.
Well, are there any other questions?
I can have some.
Sure.
Okay.
I don't mind.
Anybody from the audience without the phone that got their battery dead? Yeah, no, nothing. Thank you very much.